today is the big foundation models in brain and behavior.
Okay.
So this is the day where there'll be more like a lot of the presentations that are of interest are today. I mean, I should say for kind of like neuro, like EEG electrophys models.
Yeah.
Will be talked about today. So, luckily, one of the organizers is a member of the tower. So, plus these are going to be recorded. So these are all be. What's that?
Good. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So, but I don't think live streamed.
No.
So, or I'll check, but it won't be until like 9 or something.
Oh, okay.
On West Coast time.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's great. So, thinking about this feedback alignment problem. So this is a Nature Communications paper they mentioned in the award call. This is from 2016. This is Nature Communications. The title of this paper: Random Synaptic Feedback Weights Support Error Backpropagation for Deep Learning. So this is where they think about deep architectures and thinking about what's going on in the brain, and then thinking about what's going on in models. So the brain processes information through multiple layers of neurons. This deep architecture is represented powerfully, but complicates learning because it is difficult to identify the responsible neurons when a mistake is made. So this is this credit assignment problem that they're interested in. So, you have basically a network where there are these generic signals that are being sent, and you'd like to be able to isolate and identify where things are coming from. And, in case you have errors or mistakes, you can correct them or figure out where the errors are coming from. In machine learning, the backpropagation algorithm assigns blame by multiplying error signals with all the synaptic weights on each neuron's axon and further downstream. So this is where they use they talk about how backpropagation in machine learning can basically sort of amplifies the error signal. And so, however, this involves a precise symmetric backward connectivity pattern, which is thought to be impossible in the brain. So you have this amplification of the error, so you can identify it in some way, but this, of course, requires a specific architecture to be in place, this precise symmetric backward connectivity pattern that the brain doesn't have, because the brain has this structure which is often asymmetrical, or at least not symmetric in its structure, and it doesn't have this sort of forward this forward and backward ability where you can trace things back. Here we demonstrate that the strong architectural constraint is not required for effective error propagation. We present a surprisingly simple mechanism that assigns blame by multiplying errors by even random synaptic weights. This mechanism can transmit teaching signals across multiple layers of neurons. It performs as effectively as backpropagation on a variety of tasks. Our results help reopen questions about how the brain could use error signals and dispel long-held assumptions about algorithmic constraints on learning. So it's an interesting paper, very influential. Going into the article, networks in the brain compute via multiple layers of interconnected neurons. During learning, these neurons are believed to adjust their synapses so that network's outputs become more appropriate for its tasks. In many cases, learning is thought to utilize error signals, such as those that result from mismatches between expected and actual perceptions, or between intended and realized motor behaviors. This requires mechanisms that can adjust the weight of synapses earlier in a network. So if you take synapse between X sub I and H sub J, and they show this in figure 1 on the basis of downstream errors. And that's shown, so this example is figure 1A, Xi and HJ, and then this other example, E, is also shown in figure 1, so for the error. Naive learning rules could adjust synapses deep within a network based on the correlations between a scalar error signal and the neuronal activity. However, the performance of such learning rules slows significantly as the size of a network grows. So as the network gets bigger, the performance of these naive learning rules decreases. And so this is just, obviously because the number of neurons in network, as they increase, the variance and estimates of a neuron's contribution to the error also increase. So the more neurons you have, the more likely it is that the error could be from a larger number of neurons, and thus lowering the probability of finding any one path. More powerful learning rules could send specific teaching signals to a neuron based on how that neuron contributed to the error. In artificial intelligence, an algorithm called backpropagation of error, or backprop, is used to assign error on a neuron-by-neuron basis. Backprop works well in real-world applications, underlies recent advances in reinforcement and unsupervised learning, and it can account for cell responses in some areas of cortex. But for a variety of reasons, it has been difficult to imagine how a learning algorithm, such as backprop, could be implemented by neural circuits in the brain. And so one of the most significant issues is that backprop requires that downstream errors are fed back to upstream neurons by an exact symmetric copy of the downstream synaptic weight matrix. So this requires sort of this symmetric connectivity. You can't have a lot of structure in the network. You can't have a lot of asymmetric structure specifically. More precisely, backprop multiplies error signals E by weight matrix WT, which is the transpose of the forward synaptic set of synaptic connections W. This issue was described in detail by Grossberg, who named it the weight transport problem. The name arises from the fact that for each neuron, information about downstream synaptic weights must be transported to make optimal updates to the neuron's incoming or forward synaptic weights. Backprop requires each neuron hidden deep within the network to have precise knowledge of all its downstream synapses, since the error signal arriving at a hidden unit must be multiplied by the strength of that neuron's forward synaptic connections to the source of the error. Weight transport was also identified as a major problem by Zipser and Rummelhart, and their concerns were echoed by Crick, who noted that, when taken at face value, backprop seems to require rapid information transfer back along axons from each of its synaptic outputs. So this is figure 1, and the caption here is random feedback weights can deliver useful teaching signals. So what we're looking for are teaching signals that assign the location of the error and train the network to avoid making that error again. And that's what we're doing here. So in A, we have an example. We have X, H, and Y. Those are the 3 layers. We have X of I, which is this neuron here in the middle. That's part of the input. It goes to H sub J, which is in the J layer, and that is a feed forward connection. And then H sub J then feeds to each of the 3 Y neurons equally. And then there's this feedback mechanism where you take the outputs of each Y, and they feed back to J sub or H sub J using this error term here, and that gives us this signal that says, okay, you've made an error or you've made a correct choice, and this is, so there's a feedback mechanism, but the idea is to correct the error that's been made. And then, of course, B, we have these layers. So we have WO, which is the input to the hidden layer, and then W, which maps the hidden layer to the output layer, and then the transpose of WWT, which maps the output layer back to the hidden layer. And so you can see that that's basically how they treat this as a transposition problem. And then C shows WO, which is going from the input layer to the hidden layer. And then we have W, which is the hidden layer to the output layer, and B, which is sort of the feedback. And then we have this model of actual biological synapses on axons. So we see HJ, which is this hypothetical neuron with axons, and the axons have synapses over here. These synapses here are imagined as this matrix WO, which is these ith-jth connections. So you have all these different connections here going into HJ, and then you have this error here, which is this neuron here, B, and so you have this synaptic connection here between HJ and B, and that's what you see here, which is this feedback mechanism. So basically, the idea is to trace back the error to a specific source, use that error to learn not to make that error again, and then improves the performance of the network. Okay, so then a number of studies have suggested potential solutions to the weight transport problem. Indeed, encouraged by initial empirical observations, several theoretical studies examined the possibility that backprop might in fact be implemented via the retrograde transmission of information along axons, and that's shown here in D. However, further empirical work has shown that retrograde transport operates on timescales that are orders of magnitude slower than forward propagating neural activity, making it fundamentally unable to support backprop-like learning. As an alternative to sending error information anadromically, it has been suggested that errors could instead be fed back through a second network. However, most of these approaches either assume that forward and feedback connections are symmetric, or that they propose more intricate learning rules for the backwards weights that maintain precise symmetry. These approaches to the weight transport problem have helped to perpetuate the view that to achieve backprop-like learning performance, the brain would have to exhibit precise symmetric information, and does so despite achieving only a modest symmetry and reciprocal connectivity. Of course, these observations are compatible with the possibility that the brain makes use of more intricate architectures or more complex algorithms. Our results also leave open many open questions about how the brain might implement fast, error-driven learning. Importantly, however, they reveal much lower architectural constraints on what is required for effective error propagation across multiple layers of neurons. So that is the basis of their paper. Then they give these results, which are that random feedback weights can deliver useful teaching signals. So they have this matrix of random feedback weights, and they can use that as a tutoring mechanism. And then they call this feedback alignment, and this matches backprop in terms of its performance. So you have backprop in this black function here, and feedback alignment in the green function, and they're pretty much very similar. Feedback alignment learns under a variety of conditions. So this means that it generalizes well, and that these signals can serve to correct the network under a variety of conditions. And so this is an example here of how feedback alignment works in multi-layer networks comprised of nonlinear neurons. Again, comparing backprop and then mapping this out in a network. The 3-layer network and a 4-layer network. So we saw the 3-layer network in figure 1 and figure 3. We see the 4-layer network. Then figure 4, feedback alignment operates in larger networks, more complex dynamics. So using the MNIST dataset as input, we have the signal of the hidden units, we have then the signal of the output units, and we get these patterns here. And so it's able to, feedback alignment is able to deal with this network and its input. And so the discussion, the most effective forms of learning in large networks of neurons rely on mechanisms that adjust synaptic weights according to errors that are detected further downstream. In re-examining the conditions under which neural networks can exhibit such forms of deep learning, we have identified a new algorithm that we call feedback alignment. We show that in its simplest form, feedback alignment is able to make use of a fixed random connectivity pattern to update synaptic weights throughout a network. To our surprise, even with such minimal constraints on connectivity patterns, feedback alignment can achieve learning performances that are comparable to the backpropagation of error algorithm. Critically, this demonstrates that the kind of precise synaptic connectivity between layers of neurons that is required by backprop is not essential to achieve effective transmission of error across layers. In characterizing the performance of feedback alignment, we first demonstrated that the algorithm is effective in using error signals to update synaptic weights in simple linear and nonlinear networks. We then showed that feedback alignment is also effective in larger networks that incorporate multiple hidden layers, and in networks that exhibit sparse connectivity or impose more realistic constraints on how activity is represented. Finally, our investigations into how feedback alignment works suggest that the algorithm's power relies on the fact that the weight matrices of the forward-going synapses evolve to align approximately with those in the feedback pathway. Taken together, our study reveals much lower architectural constraints on what is required for error propagation across layers of neurons, and this provides insights into how neural networks might support fast learning in large deep networks. Feedback alignment offers a surprising and simple solution to the problem of synaptic weight transport. As with many forms of learning that have been proposed to occur in the brain, it makes use of the idea that teaching signals could be carried by reciprocal connections, and there are a whole host of references on that. However, in the case of feedback alignment, we have shown that this does not depend on detailed symmetric reciprocal connectivity, and yet it is still able to train large networks quickly. There are, of course, many outstanding questions regarding how the brain could utilize learning processes that rely on error propagation to adapt upstream synaptic connections in a network. This includes how exactly the brain computes and represents errors, and how the feed-forward and feedback pathways might interact with one another. So we need to figure this out to sort of understand supervised learning, and it's not unique to any one algorithm. This is a problem that is sort of an artifact of taking sort of a brain-inspired model and abstracting it down to the type of system we have in layered deep networks, where we have connections, we have weight matrices, but we don't have the rest of the mechanisms in the brain that, biologically this is handled with ease. So this is kind of going through how this relates to supervised learning. So a key insight that has been that rather than requiring an external teacher, errors can result from mismatches between expected and actual perceptions, or between intended and realized motor consequences. So this is, of course, an insight, of course, that you see in active inference as well, whereas there's this mismatch between a prior distribution or a prior experience and a current experience, and that contributes to a posterior distribution that's constantly updated. So this is very similar in that way to active inference. And of course, this is in contrast to having this tutor or having this supervisor or supervised learning mechanism. So for example, it is possible to derive teaching signals from sensory input by trying to predict one modality from another, by trying to predict the next term in a temporal sequence, or by trying to encode and reconstruct sensory information. These processes can be thought of as supervised tasks, with the sensory activity itself playing the role of the teacher. Indeed, experimental data from a range of systems has shown that neuronal populations represent prediction mismatch and motor errors in their activity. So this is, again, common in motor control and in some other areas of neuroscience where you're looking for the mismatch. And of course, in cybernetics too, where we deal with these kind of systems that have good regulation. And so it's not so much about supervision, it's about learning from the error, learning from the mismatch, and then continuing to do that over time. So as with other forms of hierarchical learning, An important question is how feed-forward and feedback pathways interact with one another in the brain. It is well established that there are extensive feedback pathways that carry information from higher areas to lower sensory areas, and these connections have been shown to modulate the tuning properties and therefore the activity of neurons in lower areas. It therefore seems likely or perhaps inevitable that this top-down modulation of neuronal activity will impact the learning that goes on in the lower areas neuron synapses. Indeed, recent work has demonstrated that learning sensorimotor tasks alters representations in early cortical areas. For higher layers to deliver error information that could enable lower layers to make useful changes to their synaptic weights, neurons in the lower layers should, at least in part, be able to differentiate a top-down error signal from activity originating in a forward pathway. Thus, a prediction is that one of the functions of backward pathways is to ultimately modulate plasticity processes at the synapses of a neuron in the forward pathway. In this regard, it is interesting that experimental evidence has shown that various third factors can modulate the magnitude and sign of synaptic plasticity mechanisms. And again, this is an artifact of the representation, the high level of abstraction from the brain we use in deep learning networks or in layered neural networks. That of you only have the weight of the connection. You don't have multiple synapses that are kind of maybe average those out or kind of figure out what the mean value is. We don't really model those in any meaningful way. And so this is, of course, going to remove some of the sort of the mechanisms that we may not know about that occur in the brain. So these third factors, of course, result in part from some of the neurophysiology. They could also be other types of things that result from emergence in the brain. Depolarizing inputs arriving at specific times in or subcellular compartments, neuromodulators, different types of synapse can all regulate plasticity, resulting from the pairing of pre- and post-synaptic activity. So one example of this is that Hebbian learning protocols that result in long-term potentiation at neocortical synapses can be altered to result in long-term depression if they occur simultaneously with local subthreshold depolarizing inputs into the postsynaptic dendrite. And of course, then there's this other finding where an empirically grounded learning mechanism has been proposed in which forward and teaching signals are delivered concurrently into dendritic and somatic compartments, respectively. So there are a lot of ways to model this. And of course, we're not really interested in this paper in terms of brain modeling or neural modeling. We're interested in optimizing the performance of neural networks. So of course, there is this difference in the two. These observations suggest that there are a variety of plasticity mechanisms that would enable feed-forward and feedback pathways to interact during learning. Indeed, any task-driven learning will require mechanisms that serve to modulate ongoing plasticity. So, for example, reinforcement learning requires the delivery of a global signal that can be thought of as a widespread third factor for regulating ongoing synaptic plasticity. So this is interesting. They kind of bring up the global signal that results from reinforcement learning. At the other end of the spectrum, a learning algorithm such as backprop would require a much more highly orchestrated computation and delivery of third factors to individual neurons in the hidden layer. By contrast, feedback alignment representing a surprising middle ground in that it has many of the performance advantages of backprop, but it markedly reduces the complexity of the machinery for computing and delivering third factors, which are these modulatory signals in feedback alignment that can be delivered via random connections by one or many neurons in the backward pathway to one or many neurons in the hidden layer, and the modulatory signals themselves are computed on the basis of random connections in the backward pathway. So if I'm understanding this correctly, we're using stochasticity to sort of augment the system and correct errors. And this sort of represents a middle ground between backprop and then, trying to build in all of these complex mechanisms and third factors. So even something like reinforcement learning would be hard to sort of add into the network, but having sort of a neural modeling paradigm will also slow down our computations quite a bit. So using, stochasticity to sort of paper over that, or at least serve as a way to simulate that is kind of what they're suggesting, which is interesting because if you, you kind of think about it, you can do a lot of things with randomness, and this is true in biology, but also true in simulation. So it's an interesting point. Can you reduce all these mechanisms to sort of a random matrix? I guess it works here. And so, yeah, this just kind of goes through some more insights. And I think that's enough for that paper. So, so that was the award winner for this year, the Sejnowski-Hinton Prize. Any comments or questions on that?